Hi everyone, so we just got a really great surprise here. The patch 1.50 for Season 5 has been data mined. So this is actually ahead of the launch of the PTR. Blizzard decided to give us a pre-download and it's actually going live in what I expect to be around 14 hours from now. But here on Wowhead they have actually managed to get the entire patch kind of listed out with the before and after changes already. And there's a lot of really big surprises in there that I want to go through in this video. I just had a little bit of time now to kind of like skim through it a little bit, look for some of the big stuff. I will be discussing this in detail on my stream and of course as we play the PTR. But this was just like right before bedtime for me. So I decided to stay up another half hour and see what we find here. And there's quite some surprises. So one thing that is definitely striking here is that there are a lot more legendary powers in this patch than we originally thought. You see this here, for example, there's new aspects, for example, for the Barb here, and then there's more for the Druid down here, and none of them were, well, some of them were listed in the patch notes, but not as many. In the campfire, Blizzard has said that they have added 50 legendaries and uniques combined, and so we didn't really see that many when they originally posted the patch notes, and here they are. So it's actually kind of interesting. And I was not really expecting to see so many, and there's some really cool stuff. So I can start with this one here. This was not in the patch notes. This is the aspect of anger management for barbs. It seems somewhat weak to me. You basically get a permanent berserking state if you have high enough fury. Seems like a very easy trigger, but mostly something for very early game, I guess, because it's usually easy to solve berserking uptime, but who knows. Then there's also this here, the aspect of forward momentum, knocking back an enemy grants you movement speed. Also does not seem that great to me. There are better movement aspects, and again, barbarians don't really need that, I think. But who knows. Then we have the aspect of the fortress. So this is an interesting one. So this gives you extra damage reduction as you have lower life, up to, I guess, 50% damage reduction when you are near 0 life. Now this is pretty strong, I believe, because usually barbarians are not really in danger of getting one-shot because they are already pretty beefy boys. And this means that this could be a really nice aspect to just include into your build when you don't really have much else. If you don't run, for example, a generator in your build and you can't run the might aspect and, for example, you don't have a Harlequin crest yet, then this is actually really nice to just include there, and it has no condition, it's damage reduction on the character, and that is usually very powerful because it will apply to any damage you take, and it's not something that has a conditional effect based on what the enemy does, how the status of the enemy or something like that. So I really like this Fortress one here. Then you have Executioner's aspect. It says killing an enemy with an overpower leaves behind an earthquake at the location, dealing physical damage over time and can only occur every 4 seconds. That's kind of interesting. It gives us another trigger for earthquakes. Usually this can be done with ground stomp and with leap. Usually the way to do this is with leap basically these days. But here you can just get it by default. And this is cool because you can combine this with extra earthquake duration, which I believe has now become a utility temper. And then you can combine this, for example, with the rumble glyph. So as long as you keep killing enemies, you can actually have those 3 earthquakes up or so and get a permanent damage boost. So it seems like a really nice, especially farming aspect. You don't really care about this earthquake doing much. It's more to just buff you. Kind of good one here. Then you have the druids. So there's an aspect of the rushing wilds. I think this was actually in the patch notes. There's extra movement speed here for using companion skills. There's actually some more companion stuff here, the moon rage aspect. And this is an interesting one as well. There seems to be a kind of a common theme that has made its way into this patch. It's just that they're bringing back a lot of the Malignant Heart powers from Season 1. So I was actually expecting this to happen right after Season 1, and they did bring back some of them, I guess, in the form of the Varshan rings. But there were a lot of cool powers that we had back then that never made it back into the game. And here we are. This is one of the Druid Hearts that allows you to summon extra wolf companions, and you can have up to 3 extra wolves and get +3 ranks to your wolves. So for companion druids, that's actually a pretty big deal because you can effectively double the amount of wolves that you have. And companion druids are already looking kinda okay. So this might make it really interesting as long as you manage to actually produce those lucky hits to get those wolves. But they last 35 seconds, that's a pretty long time. So I think this will actually not be too hard to achieve and have those extra 3 wolves up all the time. So it's pretty nice. And it's also, for example, synergized with the reworked Shepherd's aspect. The more companions you have, the more damage they deal. So this could just be also a buff tool to, for example, the damage of some of your other companions, like especially the Poison Creeper for the poison. Then we have the rejuvenating aspect. When falling below 20 spirit, there is a 30% chance to fully restore your spirit. Kinda interesting. It's I guess also kind of like an early game power, because I guess late game you usually don't want to drop to low spirit. And if you do, then you also want to kind of not have a chance to not go back to full, I guess. So it's kind of nice to have, but nothing I would really consider to be very good right now. There's also the Spirit Bond aspect here. This is a pretty powerful one. 17.5% of the damage you would take is redirected across your companions, and your companions cannot die. So this effectively means this is a bit like, I guess, the Unity Ring from Diablo 3, where you just take less damage, and it sounds like your companions will just not take any damage. So you just take less damage, basically. It's just like, as long as you have any companion, you can use this, and you can now take less damage. And this is a huge benefit to druids, because druids really have a severe lack of good defensive powers. They have a bunch of the, like, you know, regular general powers, basically, like, I don't know, protector aspect for a barrier or so. But they're not really something that you want to use most of the time. And there are definitely a lot of builds that just have trouble even finding one good defensive power. And this is definitely something that can fit into many builds, in particular those that run Poison Creeper to get poisons on the target for example, Envenom. So I really like this one here. Then we have the Necromancers. We have Aspect of Creeping Mist. This is one of the new ones that was also in the patch notes. It gives you insane evade. So I think I'm going to see some funny clips very soon. I've already tried to kind of understand how far this goes, and it seems like this is going to be kind of a combination of evade and then a double evade and then another evade that you can do by combining this with Blood Mist that goes basically beyond even like the longest range teleport that you could do right now. That seems pretty wild, and Necro's going to be zooming. Then we also have the Cursed Aura here. I think this is also something from the Millennium Hearts. It says you automatically curse enemies around you with Decrepify and Iron Maiden, and curses inflicted this way spread to surrounding targets and last 4 seconds outside of the aura. So this is really cool, I think, especially considering this is a utility aspect, so you can kind of just throw this on your boots or something like that, or maybe even like a chest piece. And well, both curses at once, especially defensive benefit, I think, where you get Decrepify for the DR, you can slow enemies, you get the healing when you kill enemies with the Iron Maiden, for example. You can even get resources from that, I think. And you can also get a cooldown reduction effect. So in general, this is like an all-round crazy package here that I really like. And I think a lot of people really love this. I think this was one of the craziest hearts back in Season 1 as well. That a lot of people really played with this thing, I believe. Then you have the Great Feast aspect. Your minions deal 45% increased damage, but each one drains 1 essence from you per second. If you have no active minions, the damage increase applies to you instead, and you lose 7 essence per second. That's a kind of interesting one, I believe. I think this might be relatively useful for potentially a pure golem build without skellies, because then you don't really have a big downside, but you get a relatively large power boost to the golem. I'm not sure if that's really going to be a thing. Otherwise, I guess you could use it for yourself, but losing 7 essence per second is quite a lot. And if you just want to buff your own damage, you usually have a lot of good aspects to take for that already. Necros have no shortage of very powerful aspects to put on very few slots. So I'm not sure how this will fit in exactly, but there might be some possibilities here, I guess. Or maybe if you ever get any kind of reason to actually have as little essence as possible, this could be kind of a good idea to include here, but right now I can't really think of any scenarios for that. Then we have the aspect of the Unholy Tether. Casting Golem's active skill creates a bond between you for 6 seconds. While the bond is active, both of you are unhindered and gain 40% movement speed. Unhindered is a new keyword that means that you cannot be slowed and you can walk through enemies, so basically the Ghost Walker effect. Well, for a golem based build, this is insane. 40% movement speed. It's going to make it very easy to cap out. I was saying that the Necro is going to be zooming until you see why. So it's going to be very easy to kind of cap out your movement speed already quite early into the progression, where usually you kind of have to get to level 100 first, have to find a good amulet with movement speed, you have to find good boots with movement speed, temper that stuff, and then at some point you will cap out. But here, this is something you can just throw on your boots, and then you start blasting basically. So it's really good aspect here, at least for the early game. Until later you will drop this for better stuff. Then we have the Imprisoned Spirits aspect. This was also in the patch notes, I believe. Bone Spirit explode. When Bone Spirit explodes inside a bone prison, it explodes an additional time for 70% of the damage. If you put this on a neck, it can actually do more than the original, or even on a two-handed weapon, it can do even more than that. So that's kind of interesting. And it says Bone Spirit prioritizes enemies inside of a bone prison. So in general, Bone Spirit looks to be like the build for Necros in Season 5. At least from the numbers so far, it is already pretty powerful in Season 4, and it's getting this, and there's also, I think, some unique item for it or so that really beefs this up. So it's pretty powerful, I believe. Then we have the Inexorable Reapers aspect. This one was also in the patch notes, but it says Sever now dashes you forward to attack instead. It becomes a mobility skill and costs no essence, but has a 7 to 22 seconds cooldown. This is incredible, because if that actually goes the same distance as the Sever, it goes pretty far, kind of like the distance of like a leap or a teleport or so, maybe slightly less, but it has a very short cooldown, only 7 seconds base cooldown that you can then reduce with extra cooldown reduction on your neck or your offhand or your helm. And you can probably get down to like, 3 seconds or something if you really try. And, well, Necros be zooming, that's for sure. Then we have the Shade Mist aspect. Your minions deal 38 or whatever scalable number here. Shadow damage per second to enemies around them. The damage over time lasts for 2 to 5 seconds after leaving the aura. Now, this sounds like something that could be pretty interesting for Shadow Blight based builds, because you could potentially trigger the Blighted aspect very easily. That has been freshly nerfed, so we'll see how this will actually perform, but it is another way to do that. So maybe this could allow you to actually do like a real like Shadow Blight, like kind of burst build with this by just having a lot of minions and triggering that Shadow Blight or key passive rather over and over and do damage with that. Outside of that, yeah, I guess that's probably a relatively easy way of triggering Shadow Blight in general, so this might be useful for some builds. Now let's continue with the rogue here. So we have the first one, Aspect of Iron Rain. I believe this was in the patch notes. Smoke Grenade has a 50% chance to create an arrow storm where it explodes, dealing physical damage over 3 seconds, and arrow storms continuously apply a vulnerable. Now, I don't think this is a very good aspect. Arrow storms was used by some people in Season 4, but it really doesn't lead anywhere. And even with some buffs and stuff like this, it will not really go anywhere. We're very far off from that. That being said, though, they did add some stuff to some of the other Arrow Storms aspects, or rather the Word of Arcane actually, to make them synergize, so you can buff Rain of Arrows with those Arrow Storm aspects. Not this one, however, the other Arrow Storms aspects now give it a damage buff, and this is actually a bit of a reason to run them. I've actually crafted a build around this already, that you will probably see soon. Then we have the aspect of Nebulous Bruise. Using a healing potion grants 50% movement speed for 3 seconds. The numbers keep getting larger on those mobility aspects as we go down here. It's kind of funny. 50% movement is already half of the bonus cap that you can even have, which is kind of crazy. And every 30 meters you travel, you spawn a healing potion. Now, I think this is not a very good aspect, despite the number looking very high, because it's very easy to reach mobility or movement speed cap rather for rogues. And just in general, like, you don't need that much movement speed. But this might be, again, a pretty good early game aspect. It's just like speed up the progression, speed up, like when you're level 30 or something, you find this aspect, you're gonna feel good about it. Every 30 meters of travel is a long distance. That's basically an entire screen from like left to right, pretty much. That's very far to get a healing potion. And yeah, you can probably traverse that in around 3 seconds or so, or probably slightly less. But you also need to not be full life in order to even use a healing potion. So it's not that consistent. I don't like it very much. Then we have the aspect of Stolen Vigor. I guess we can talk about that one real quick. It's just changed, but it has become an offensive power now. So this was kind of what I expected already, because this used to be a defensive power for the Momentum key passive. Momentum key passive has been buffed a little bit, and I was low-key hoping they would keep this a defensive passive based on the fact that it now grants Unstoppable. But I guess it also has a pretty strong damage buff, and I didn't want to like overlap those two things too much. What this means though is that Momentum as a key passive not granting any damage on its own is not really competitive, and you have to give up another offensive power to use Stolen Vigor, which is pretty powerful, but it's not anywhere close to enough to catch up basically to, for example, close quarters combat. So I think that for Momentum to become useful, this has to be buffed, or momentum has to be buffed in some way to also include some kind of damage component. But we'll see. Then we have Aspect of True Sight. That is a pretty interesting one. I like this one a lot. You deal 100% increased critical strike damage to enemies marked by inner sight. Now, I love this one. So this means that you can really kind of like assassinate a target with the inner sight like eye on them. But I'm not 100% sure if this will actually stay on the target while the inner sight is going off, which is usually where you have your nuke window with full resources and an extra crit buff, for example, and potentially other benefits. And I would have to go into the game to actually check that because I'm not aware of this. So it depends on whether that is active during inner sight while you have the buff. Then this could be really powerful. And then after inner sight drops, you have a 4 seconds downtime where this aspect can do nothing and you cannot proc inner sight because there's like this cooldown. So I guess the idea is that you kind of like assassinate targets one by one, maybe with something like Shadow Step or so, and do a lot of extra damage, or maybe just for killing bosses. This might be a really interesting aspect to have if you play an inner sight build. So I'm definitely going to keep my eyes on this one. Then we have the Breakneck Bandits aspect. This is a new flurry aspect that was in the patch notes. Yeah, flurry deals increased damage and has a chance to stun enemies with each hit. Flurry hits 4 times, so you basically have a combined around 80% value here. So this means that you get pretty consistent stuns every 1 to 2 flurries or so that last for 30 seconds. So very easy to just perma-stun stuff until they become unstoppable. Proc a lot of stagger as well. So really good aspect for flurry builds. Flurry in general looking pretty good. Then you have the Clandestine aspect. That's a new one. Gain +3 to agility and subterfuge skills. And that's all it says. I really like the simplicity of this thing. That's really fun. And I wonder if you can make anything of this. Like, there is a reason to invest into agility skills, in particular dash, I guess, to get a lower cooldown. Unfortunately, the same does not apply to Caltrops and Shadow Step. They just get extra damage, which is a bit of a missed opportunity, I guess. But Subterfuge skill ranks is pretty good because that includes Dark Shroud. And getting extra ranks to Dark Shrouds is really powerful, especially if you have a lot of them already. So we don't know about the new unique chest that synergizes with Dark Shroud. That might have a lot of ranks to it as well. But even if you just have a normal chest, you can get +8 ranks to Dark Shroud. You can have +4 from the Harlequin Crest. So that's a total of +12. You can get 5 from your skill tree. That's 17 ranks. And then you can get 3 extra. And potentially even double of that if you put this on a two-handed weapon. That's a lot of extra ranks with Dark Shrouds, basically making you almost immortal at that point. So that is pretty crazy, and I'm definitely going to keep my eyes on that. And of course, it helps out a little bit with stuff like a Shadow Step build, where you could potentially get extra skill ranks to deal more damage with that. Shadow Step seems like it actually might be a real build now in Season 5 after all. Then we have Cold Clip Aspect. Your basic skills are always cold imbued, and you deal 20% increased damage to enemies who are chilled or frozen. So this is at least correctly labeled as an offensive power, and not like, for example, Noxious Eyes here, that is utility. By the way, getting buffed to 35% extra damage against frozen enemies. So it's kind of strange that this one is not an offensive power, but this one is, I believe. So I don't know why it didn't do that. But it is a really cool aspect. I really like this. I think in general, imbuing your basic attacks in some ways, for example, with Pestilent Points was already really cool, but it only applied to Puncture. And now you can do something like this. You have Cold Imbue for all of your basic skills. So I love this one. It just allows you to kind of slowly, for example, stagger bosses with the chill. You can then also freeze like elites, for example, very easily by just spamming basic skills into them. So that has some natural synergy with combo point builds. I really like this one. And we'll see, there might be some opportunities for this here. So 20% damage buff is not really great, but it's not terrible. However, it also makes kind of like the stagger problem worse a little bit if you run this, for example, because rogues usually need to stagger bosses to do any real damage to them. And this kind of just like plays into that same problem again. But it also helps you to stagger them, I guess. And then we have the Galvanized Slashers aspect. Says lucky hit, damaging an enemy with a mobility skill has up to a 30% chance to fully restore your energy, and your maximum energy is increased by 25. Now, the lucky hit on Shadow Step is really high. It actually has a 100% base lucky hit, and you can stack a lot of extra lucky hit to the point where you can almost guarantee this effect. Not quite, but you can probably get to like a 2 out of 3 or so if you really try. Is that really good? I mean, fully restoring your energy when you have a lot of maximum energy and you combine this with something like, for example, Beastfall boots, where you use an ultimate and then you spend all of your resources at once, you could try to refill them with this. So I guess that's kind of the idea here. Is that very good? Maybe. It is also relatively easy to trigger when you just dash into a pack, or even run caltrops and just throw a caltrops into a pack of like 10 targets, for example. So that could kind of help. Realistically though, I don't see many rogue builds actually running a resource power for the purpose of generating resources in the end game. I think this is again more of like an early game thing here. Then we have the mired sharpshooters aspect. This is also one that was on the patch notes, and it seems like the damage on it seems somewhat low. It says caltrops is now a marksman skill that also throws 5 to 20 piercing daggers over its duration, each dealing 15 shadow damage and applying vulnerable for 3 seconds. Now, is it going to be useful? Well, caltrops being a marksman skill allows you to not run another marksman skill on your bar for the purpose of, for example, tricks of the trade or close quarters combat activation. So that is a pretty big benefit here. I don't think that these piercing daggers are really going to be like a DPS build or something like that. It's actually a utility aspect, so it doesn't seem like it's intended to really do significant amounts of damage. And then we get this extra vulnerable. So having kind of like easy, permanent vulnerable uptime and potentially some triggers like tricks of the trade could make this worth running, but I guess we'll see. And it does compete with utility aspects like the Noxious Ice I've explained earlier, or Frostbitten aspect, and these kind of things. So if those were properly labeled as offensive powers that they really are, then something like Mired Sharpshooters would probably get more consideration. Then we have the Sorcerer. So there's some cool stuff here as well. We have some new ones. Here's the aspect of 10 years agility. Now, this is not one of the most interesting ones, I guess. This is a movement speed buff when you don't use a defensive skill in the last 8 seconds. So it seems like Blizzard is really trying to kind of push that notion of not running any of those. There's also an offensive aspect that gives you a damage buff for pretty much the same condition. And I think also a defensive power at this point, I'm not sure. So they're trying to slowly push kind of like that non-defensive meta. We're not quite there yet, but we are slowly getting there, I guess. So we'll see. Then you have the aspect of the Firebird. Gain the Flame Shield enchantment for free. When Flame Shield activates, meteorites fall all around you for some extra damage. Is that really good? Yeah, it's a utility power. Maybe for hardcore, you can throw this in there or something like that if you really want to. Otherwise, I don't really see people really running this, because it doesn't protect you from a one-shot. You have to kind of like lose a lot of life and survive, and then it triggers a Flame Shield for you, which can be useful, but I guess in many circumstances, you kind of go from 100 to 0 when your barriers are down. But it does help to kind of like enable a more life-based playstyle potentially, where again, you don't run defensive skills, for example, and then we have this here. Then we have the aspect of the Orange Herald. Lucky hit, up to 10% chance to reduce the cooldown of your ultimate skill by 2 seconds, can only happen once per skill cast. That is really cool, I think, because well, at least 2 of the Sorc ultimates are actually really short cooldowns. One is Inferno, and one is Unstable Currents, so they can reduce it in various ways to already have a relatively low cooldown. And now we have this to effectively just spam them or have perma Unstable Currents. There's also Deep Freeze, which I cannot say I've ever used, to be honest. I think that is not a really great ultimate in general. It's an interesting one, but doesn't really have much of a purpose in many builds, besides maybe resetting your cooldowns a little bit here and there. But either way, this is a nice aspect, and it's utility, so you can actually kind of throw this into many builds and just increase the consistency. At the very least, for like maybe early game, especially for example Lightning Sorc builds that want to rely on Unstable Currents, permanent uptime, this could really help you out here to make sure that you actually get there before you have really good gear and really high cooldown reduction on your items. Then we have the Firestarter aspect. This is a new one, I think. When newly burning an enemy, you deal additional X fire damage to them, and this effect is treated as a pyromancy skill. Now, is that really good? It's flat damage when you try to do a burn build, and that doesn't really have the best synergy necessarily. But it can also mean that, for example, you can scale flat damage aspects. So there's other ways, for example, the new Rakonov boots that also have some kind of like fire damage explosion around you whenever you use a cooldown. And this is also like flat damage. And you can try to, instead of doing like a burning build with this, you can try to just make like a proc build basically that is reliant on stuff like Firestarter Aspect, stuff like even Elemental Surge or these kind of effects. and just try to do damage with like these raw damage effects. Now this says this effect is treated like a pyromancy skill. At first glance, I can't really think of many good interactions for this, to be honest. I guess it might have a few benefits from like Paragon nodes, like the Asus key passive, the Asus Paragon node, like for the extra crit chance or something like that, extra crit damage, and maybe something like pyromancy skill damage that applies from your temperers, but you would never really go for that these days. So not really sure how well this will perform. We don't really know how well this scale up in higher levels, but it might be something. Then we have the jolting aspect here. It says every few seconds you zap a nearby enemy for 225 lightning damage, and this effect is treated as a shock skill. So kind of the same story here. Actually, you can get this every 1 second. You zap a target. So it's kind of just like constantly like ding, 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 kind of like that. But again, we don't know how much damage it will do. But it could somewhat fit into, for example, something like an Ezador's build. If you want to try to do something with Crackling Energy, Ezadora, and then this aspect as well, to just have like more of these flat damage effects. So maybe there is actually something to it. I guess one interesting part about this is that it could also trigger the newly reworked Veer's Mastery key passive, which says that you need to do a crit with a shock skill to get charged. And while charged, you have damage reduction and you have a chance for your crits to deal extra damage or jump to extra enemies and stuff like that. And this actually allows you to do that. And it does it passively all the time. As long as you have any kind of like non-terrible crit chance, you'll basically guarantee that you will have the Veer's effect active, effectively triggering this damage reduction and some other effects. So this is really where this comes in, I believe. But do you want to give up an offensive slot for that when you have only so few? I'm not sure about it, unless it does a lot of damage. Then we have the lightning rod aspect here. Chain lightning has 35% chance to chain additional time when hitting bosses or crowd control enemies and prefers them as targets. This was in the patch notes. I don't believe this to actually really work well with the new unique that they made for chain lightning. Maybe you don't even want to use both of them at the same time. At least currently my expectation is that there's zero synergy, but I guess we'll find out. If there's any kind of synergy, it might be pretty good, but I am skeptical about it. Then we have Winter Touch aspect. When you freeze an enemy, you deal X damage to them, and this effect is treated as a frost skill. So it seems like we got one for each element here, similar as the other two, the jolting and this fire starter. So these are kind of new here. Now, can we do anything with that? We deal a bit of cold damage. I don't know, I can't really think of anything. Unless this is like a really high value, or again, you try to do something like a, proc build, and so on. So we'll see. Then we have some generic aspects. So we have the aspect of Creeping Death. This is also a Malignant Heart power from back in Season 1. That was a really powerful one. You deal 20% increased damage over time for enemies for each different crowd control effect they are afflicted by. And installable enemies and staggered bosses take 40% increased damage over time from you instead. So this is really powerful. Why is this really powerful? Well, you can stack a lot of different crowd controls. Especially these days with, for example, Worldly Fortune on your utility tempers. You can have slow, stun, freeze, chill, daze, there's probably more, knock down, knock back technically, I guess, as well, should be another one. And there's probably a few more that I'm forgetting. So you can do a lot of stuff. So that's basically what I'm saying here. So something like 3, 4, 5 times this bonus is quite achievable. And this means if you put this on a two-handed weapon, you can get something like a 200% buff or something like that. So for example, rogue builds that are like poison based, this is very powerful. And there's certainly other classes that can make use of this as well. I could imagine, something like Infamous Necro or like Cold Explosion Necros that are like, darkness based or something like that. Maybe Burning Sorcs as well. So there's a lot of opportunities here to use this aspect. It's really strong, I believe, especially if you go for those staggered bursts on the boss as well. So this is definitely something to keep an eye on here. Then we have aspect of Inevitable Fate. When an enemy falls below 35% life while afflicted with any of your damage over time effects, an explosion occurs every 7 seconds, dealing X damage for each element they're afflicted by. It's very interesting. Again, it depends on how much damage this explosion actually does. I guess it's kind of like a more reliable X-Falls explosion, so to say. So if you combine this to, for example, X-Falls, X-Falls can do a few million damage. So it's not that terrible, but it has a really high base damage value of something like 50,000 or so. I guess it depends on how much you will really scale into the hit damage. but it is supposed to work for dot builds, or at least like trying to stack different dot effects on a target. You can do this maybe on a Sorc with Andariels plus burning from Firebolt, for example. So it could be like 2 dot effects here, maybe more if you can try to fit in something else there. And I guess it'll be kind of the same story for rogues, maybe. Maybe you can even combine like several sources of the same type, but it says for each element they are afflicted by, so I guess not really. I'm not really sure where this will fit in and how much damage it will deal, but it's interesting that they just kind of like keeps popping every 7 seconds, so this might be kind of good, at least for like execute phases, for example. Then we have the aspect of Sly Steps. When you would accumulate 50% of your maximum life loss, you automatically cast an equipped defenses, subterfuge, or macabre skill before receiving damage. It can only occur once every 30 to 45 seconds and cannot cast mobility skills. Now that is a pretty nutty defensive aspect, I think. And the thing is that it automatically casts it, and it sounds like regardless of whether it is on cooldown or not. So if you look at, for example, a sorceress, you can have Flame Shield on your bar and teleport. And if you drop 50% life, you will automatically cast the Flame Shield. So this is basically a Flame Shield enchantment on crack, because instead of accumulating 100% life loss, you only have to accumulate 50%. And it has a very shorter cooldown as well. And it works for all classes as well. So there might be other cases of, for example, here's the Macabre skill. This could be like the Blood Mist for the Necros. This could save you. And similar for like Barbs, you can have like a defensive shout, like a challenging shout or something. So there's many ways to really make use of this, and it could be pretty wild, especially if this works with on cooldown immunity effects. So we'll see, but I think this is something that you can definitely slap into many builds if you already have a skill on your bar, and you know, it just gives you like this extra layer of defense, especially with hardcore. This seems to be a very good aspect. Then we have aspect of the Dark Dance, also a Malignant Heart from Season 1. Every 5 seconds, your next core skill costs X life instead of primary resource, and it will only occur if you have at least 6% of your maximum life. So you need to be at least somewhat healthy. You can't just like kill yourself with this. And skills that consume life deal 80% extra damage. That is a lot of extra damage, to be honest, for a resource aspect of all things. Kind of interesting. So the idea here, I guess, is that you have like a very low frequency in your attacks. And this would mean that, for example, for builds that don't necessarily have to spam core skills, but can do something else, and then do a core skill once in a while, this could be a pretty big benefit. Or if you have just generally low attack speed, if you do like 1 attack every second or so, this means that after 5 attacks, one of them will be free, basically, because the life cost seems to be very low, and deal 80% extra damage. And this 80% divided by, for example, 5 attacks is still a 16% extra on average boost. So even with like 1 attack per second, this is an acceptable offensive benefit. And if you have less than that, it gets better and better, to the point where, for example, if you play a combo point based rogue with somewhat low attack speed, maybe only release like 3 casts in those 5 seconds or so. If you do like, you know, puncture, 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 rapid fire, puncture, 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 rapid fire, and again, then yeah, one of them is buffed by 80%. That's pretty good. This definitely beats some other aspects you can put on a combo point rogue. And this could be combined with potentially other stuff on other classes. I guess combo point rogues definitely have some of the best synergies with this. And yeah, we'll see. Maybe if you combine this with like other combos of maybe using a master skill on a Sorc and then a core skill once in a while, or something like spam a basic attack and then use a core skill or master skill or something like that. So there are various ways of making use of this. I really like this aspect. I've used this a lot back in Season 1 as well as the Malignant Heart. Here's the aspect of the Prudent Heart. After being damaged for at least 20% of your maximum life at once, you become immune for 2.5 to 4 seconds. It can only occur once every 20 seconds. Now, I did talk about the power of this other defensive aspect here, the Sly Steps aspect. And here we have another one that is potentially even crazier than that, actually. So this seems, to be honest, pretty busted, if you ask me. This is also a defensive Malignant Heart that we had back in Season 1. I have been running with this as well a little bit. Back then, it wasn't really that necessary to go all in on defenses, but it was a pretty useful one if you wanted to be very tanky. And again, especially for hardcore, this is crazy good. With a 20 seconds cooldown, if you get damage for 20% of your maximum life at once on a big hit, so if you don't play an Omega tanky build, then a big hit can definitely do that, like, you know, a fire explosion, a poison explosion, some of the shadow bosses in the pit. Like, there are many ways to take 20% of your maximum life, and then you just get immune. Boom. that's it, and you just can't die. So this will make hardcore very easy, to be fair. Then we have the Sticker Thought aspect. Gain X thorns while channeling and for 3 seconds afterwards. Kind of interesting one. Realistically, thorns is only a buff thing, I guess. I guess there's a bit of like extra thorns availability for necros, so thorns minions is a bit of a thing as well. You could combine this with like decompose, for example, which is a channel skill. So yeah, this could be something for either something combining with whirlwind, for example, or for decompose. Not sure how good this value really is. It seems like a relatively high value, to be fair, and it's a utility aspect, which is pretty powerful. So while this is actually an offensive power in disguise, that you can put it on a slot where usually you would not have any extra damage, and that makes it relatively good. So we'll see, but I guess Fawn Spills will like this. Here's the Wild Bolt aspect. This is every 2 to 3.5 seconds, distant enemies are pulled into you and take 10% increased damage for 3 seconds. Very interesting one. It seems very powerful, especially if this pulls in everything at once. So I'm not really sure what this will mean, if this pulls them one by one, somewhat like the Grasping Whirlwind aspect, for example, from the Barbs. But if it actually pulls all distant enemies to you every 2 seconds, that seems completely broken, if you ask me. And you also have an extra damage benefit as well. So they get pulled in and you deal extra damage to them, and then potentially you could like run away from them and then pull them again to you, and then you run away from them and you pull them. You kind of like pull the entire instance to you. So if that is how it works, that sounds pretty wild. And there's many builds that I can think of that would really like this as an extra utility power. This is basically a God Slayer on crack. If it only goes like one by one and every 2 seconds it pulls like one guy, it seems pretty pointless, but it may be useful, you know, if you don't really have anything else or so, just to like, you know, get extra quality of life. Occasionally pull the elite to you in a Helltide or something like that. So there may be some cases like that, but anything that has like a little bit of density means that you just kind of have to either make the pulls yourself with Steel Grasp or so, or just run to the enemy. So we'll see about this. Now this is it pretty much for all of the new aspects that you can find from the DATAMINE. There is more interesting stuff in here though. So again, they have changed a lot of stuff here, also a lot of skill changes and so on. I didn't really go through everything just now, but there were a few things that kind of like struck my eye here. So one thing that's kind of interesting to look at here is that they have buffed some of the Uber Uniques, or the now so-called Mythic Uniques. You can see this here. This says Helm, Unique, Generic. This is like the Andariel's effect here. And it has this purple color that relates to the Mythic Uniques now. And this has received maybe a buff. And if that is true, a very substantial buff. So this is not in the patch notes. I would be kind of surprised because Andariel's is already a really powerful build right now. Andariel's Rogue at least. That is already an S tier basically. And if that suddenly gets a ×4 damage buff, that would be ridiculously powerful. This also means that if that is true, we're gonna have like an Andariel Sorc that is absolutely like a meta build as well, at least for Sorc standards. And who knows, maybe something else on other classes. So that is something here. There's also like a bunch of temper changes that we have that are also pretty important. So here we see some of those temper manuals. This has all of the changes here. A lot of stuff was kind of like moved around. This was already part of the patch notes, but we didn't really know if they would like, for example, stealth change some of the numbers. They have not actually talked about this in the patch notes, like any kind of buffs, any kind of nerfs. Just, okay, this is new, this gets moved to this temper manual and so on. And you can kind of see that here. So for example, basic augments on the rogue only has 3 options now. It's going to be way easier to make a Heartseeker setup, for example, in Season 5 again, because it's only 3 options instead of 5, because 2 of them move to utility slots now, and these kind of things. So some other classes also get similar perks. In general, I guess it should be way easier to get the stuff that you want, because temper manuals are generally going for like only 3 to 4 and not anymore for like, for example, 5 different outcomes. So that will make it a lot better and a lot easier. Now there's one interesting thing here, which is the flay duration. This was also in the patch notes already. I discussed this in my patch notes video. Flay duration is now becoming a utility temper. And I kind of believe that this was already a bug, or at least an oversight, that flay duration was also increasing the duration of the dot and not just of the buff. And especially with flay getting buffed in the mid-season patch, when it was already like the strongest damage dealing build in the entire game basically in Season 4, that seemed kind of odd. So I would not be surprised to see flay duration no longer increase the bleed duration, or if it does, to see that getting nerfed in the final outcome of the Season 5 patch, because that definitely seems unintended at this point, with flay duration becoming a utility temper. So that's something to note here. And then we also have, for example, the Bash Temper. I saw this here somewhere, Bash Cleaves. That has been nerfed now as well, and quite heavily. So we see this here. If that is correct, then Bash gets a nerf of something like 80%. That's a pretty harsh run. Kind of expected, if you ask me. To be honest, Bash has been very dominant during Season 4 and definitely overperforming. There was already like this kind of like early season patch where there was this tooltip fix that was apparently an error, as they said, which sounded like they would nerf Bash pretty early into the season, but then didn't. But I guess here we are, so the expectation was around that level of a nerf, for me at least, and I'm not surprised to see this here. So again, I just talked about Flay. I guess both of these builds are going to go way down in the future. Here's also another really cool recipe, the Nature Magic Innovation. This is for Druids. That is now also a utility temper that has Hurricane Size, Lightning Storm duration, Cycle and Armor active size, and Petrify duration. That's pretty interesting because it does have really cool combinations of powers here. So for Lightning Storm, you can now get a Lightning Storm duration here instead of on the weapon temper. Same for the Hurricane Size. So especially for the Hurricane Druid build, this allows you to have both the size and the duration together. And this is going to make it feel really good. I'm very excited to play Hurricane in Season 5 because of this change here, because you have a way bigger radius to cover and you don't have to exactly hug enemies all the time anymore. Petrify duration is also currently a weapon temper that has become a utility, which is kind of wild because Petrify is really powerful ultimate skill. And this is actually something I use currently on my Polarized Druid in Season 4 as well. So this opens up the weapon slot yet again for example, Polarized Size. So really cool synergies there. Second Armor is something that is kind of like not anything you want to press, but all the other three options are really nice here. So Druids have something to look forward to. There's also a new one here, the Necromancer Wall. This is damage reduction for your minions, Drain Vitality, and Necrotic Carapace. Kind of interesting combo here for the defensive side of Necromancers. So that could be kind of nice, but I don't think that's like damage reduction for minions is really important. I guess if you ever run into any issues with your minions not surviving, then this is the way. I just temper this like 2 times and they will never die or something. But I guess right now this is not really a problem. There's a few other little changes here. For example, Spiked Armor, Crippling Darkness for the Profane Cage recipe. We have a new one here, Rogue Innovation. That is kind of cool as well. This is also a utility temper now, and this also has Flurry Size. So again, you can put this on utility now and then open up your weapon slots for something else. For example, Cult Observation, chance to cast Puncture twice, whatever. So you can do these kind of things. Heartseeker duration is also really nice. I think Heartseeker is going to become pretty widely used basic skill for rogues, thanks to this temper now being a utility, because the Heartseeker buffs, especially for non-poison builds or non-dot builds, are really strong. So this could be really useful to kind of boost especially a burst damage on a lot of builds. I'm very excited to try this. There's some other small benefits here, like extra status sub ranks. Okay, Rogue Persistence is kind of interesting. This is your Second Wind and Aftermath. So both these passives have been changed. Second Wind can give you like barrier procs now. You can actually really enable a barrier rogue with this. That's going to be fun to try. You have shock augments here. Now you have a new recipe, or like some change recipe here, where you have only 3 options. So for lightning storks, it's going to be very useful. And we have this new discharge manual here. Only has 2 options actually. I think there was supposed to be a third one. I don't recall what it was, but maybe it's missing here in this data mine, or in this tooltip at least. I thought there was another one. Here's Slayer's Finesse. This is something that is also a, I think, generic power, or a Barb power. Vulnerable damage, damage to injured, and physical damage over time. I guess is a Barb one. And there is also another way now for Barbs, or for any class, to get critical damage and vulnerable damage and overpower and ultimate damage. So this is a new recipe that is also somewhere here that is available to everyone. So you no longer have to make a rogue if you're playing a Barb, for example, for those bleed builds and so on. Then we have Subterfuge Expertise. Not really crazy, I think. Smoke grenade damage, smoke grenade size. Yeah, kind of whatever, I think. But maybe can come in handy here and there. Ultimate Efficiency gives each of the Druid ultimates the same cooldown that you can get from the Necro temper, I believe, or it might be slightly more. So that can be helpful with the uptime of some of those ultimates, especially because Druids can reset the cooldowns of ultimates with one of their spirit boons. So that usually makes it really good to invest in the cooldown and try to get it as low as possible, so they have like basically perma uptime. So Petrify, especially with the Petrify duration I mentioned earlier. Cataclysm also has a really long duration if you try. And then there's Lacerate, okay. Grizzly Rage which has just been freshly nerfed. I don't really expect much from that, but it can be really nice. This is the Worldly Finesse recipe that I talked about, so it has the same values as whatever you can temper, critical, vulnerable, and so on the other recipes. So you can just use that in the future. You have a 1 in 4 to get the thing, so that's really good. And lastly, one tweak here to the worldly stability, where now you can go on amulets as well, which previously wasn't possible, so that was probably a bug. Now, last but not least, there are also some other pretty interesting buffs to some of those unique items. I actually missed them earlier when I was scrolling through, and I wanted to talk about them. So you have the Avarion as well. I talked about Andariel's potentially getting a pretty massive buff, and we'll see if that is actually correct based on, you know, this scaling damage value, which is always kind of like hard to predict how much that actually is. But we have something that has a pretty clear effect here, which is Avarion. So now this shrine buff lasts for 40 seconds instead of 20 seconds, and this means you can actually overlap them or potentially just get the same one again. So that makes Avarion a lot better. It has not really been used as like a meta setup or so, but well, more shrines just kind of doubles down on what this thing already does. So I really like the idea. And if you have Avarion in particular, it's very interesting to get greed shrines for this thing, because, well, gold is a pretty high value commodity. And for example, if you farm Helltide with lots of density, and you have like a greed shrine, like, I don't know, quarter of the time or something like that, well, that is pretty good. You get lots of gold from a greed shrine. So that could actually really be a boon for some classes here, like Druid and Sorc, that can actually use this and easily include this into a build, for example, for Helltide farming. So I'm gonna try this at some point and see how good that is. And we also had some other buffs here for example, Grandfather. So let me try to find that. I've seen this, and if that is correct, that is pretty wild as well. So Grandfather, 200% extra critical strike damage. That seems completely balanced, and I'm really excited to see what will happen with that thing. So yeah, that is it for my initial summary of this data mine. We'll see if all of the stuff actually comes true when the beta goes live and we get to try this out with our own characters. For now, it seems like a lot of really crazy stuff in there. A lot of these like new legendary powers, especially those coming back from the Millennium Hearts, seem to be very good and very interesting to play around with as well. So I'm quite excited for that. There's definitely lots of cool new stuff in this patch just to like shake up the meta, shake up the builds. And well, again, from what we have seen from the patch notes, for example, where people thought that stuff would get nerfed and so on, it actually doesn't really seem that way if you include all of the other changes that are occurring, and especially some of those buffs to like those uniques seem crazy. And we haven't even seen the full picture. We still don't know about the season theme. We don't know what they're gonna do with like the 100 uniques that already exist in a game, and they have pledged to rework all of them for season 5 as well. So those changes are not even here. So quite excited to see what will come out of the final result in the end. But for now, this is what I got here. So hope you enjoyed this. Let me know what you think about some of those powers I described. Is there something I missed, or maybe there was something I actually didn't see in the patch notes now as well that maybe I should be, you know, testing and covering as well at some point. So let me know. Hope you enjoyed this, and I'll see you guys next time.